In the small town of Maplewood, where the streets were lined with oak trees and the houses were painted in soft pastel colors, life moved at a steady, peaceful pace. People knew each other, waved from their porches, and often gathered in the town square for local events. However, not everything was as serene as it seemed, especially in the Maplewood Homes Association, or HOA, which had a reputation for being strict. Jason Cooper had recently moved to Maplewood, excited to start fresh in a new community. He was a man in his 30s, with dark hair and a friendly smile. As he settled in, he quickly learned that the HOA took its rules very seriously. They enforced regulations about lawns, paint colors, and even the types of fences residents could build. However, Jason thought to himself that as long as he kept his yard neat and didn't cause any trouble, he would be fine. One sunny Saturday morning, while Jason was watering his garden, he noticed a vehicle parked outside his home. It was an unfamiliar car, and a man in a crisp uniform stepped out. The man looked official, with a badge and a clipboard in hand. Jason walked over, curious about who this visitor was. "Hello. I'm Officer Ted Wright," the man said with a smile. "I'm from the HOA. We're conducting inspections today, and I need to take a look at your property." Jason's heart sank. "Inspection? For what?" "Just some routine checks," Officer Wright replied, flipping through his clipboard. "I've heard of some violations in the area. Don't worry, it's just a formality." Jason felt uneasy but nodded, deciding not to argue. He led Officer Wright around his house, showing him the backyard and the garden. The officer scribbled notes, nodding at times and narrowing his eyes at others. As they circled back to the front, Jason felt a knot in his stomach. After the inspection, Officer Wright turned to Jason. "I'm afraid I have to cite you for a couple of violations," he said abruptly. "Violations? What kind?" Jason asked, surprised. "Your fence is a little too tall, and I noticed some weeds in your flower beds," Officer Wright said, pretending to write something on his clipboard. "But I've only been here a month. I wasn't aware of any rules. I'll fix it right away." Jason pleaded. "He's just doing his job." A voice chimed in from behind them. It was Linda, the woman who lived next door. She had long, curly hair and was known for her community involvement. "Officer Wright doesn't have to be so harsh," she added defensively. "Rules are rules," Officer Wright stated, his voice growing firm. "You'll have to pay fines unless you correct the issues. I will be back in 2 weeks to make sure everything is done." With that, he turned on his heel and walked to his car. Jason was left dumbfounded. How could a simple inspection turn into a fine? Frustrated, Jason decided to gather more information about the HOA regulations. He spent the next few days reading through the bylaws, meeting neighbors, and discovering that many felt the same way about the HOA's strictness. He learned that Officer Wright had a reputation for being overly zealous about his duties. On a Tuesday afternoon, as Jason sat at his kitchen table, trying to figure out how he would pay for the fines, a loud knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Linda, looking more urgent than usual. "Jason, you need to come with me," she said, pulling him towards her house. "What's going on?" Jason asked, still confused. "I think Officer Wright is a fake," Linda replied, her eyes wide with disbelief. "He doesn't belong to any official organization. I did some digging." "What do you mean?" Jason asked. "I called the town's police department, and they confirmed they have no record of anyone named Ted Wright working for the HOA or as a local officer. We need to do something," Linda exclaimed. Jason's heart raced. "So, he's not an officer? He was pretending." "Exactly," she said. "Let's gather evidence." They quickly began to piece things together. They contacted other neighbors, and within a few hours, they had gathered several testimonies, photographs, and a video of Officer Wright during his inspection at Jason's house. That evening, they took their findings to the Maplewood Town Hall. After some convincing, they met with the town mayor, an older gentleman named Mayor Rogers. He listened intently as Jason and Linda explained everything. "I've heard rumors about this Officer Wright before," Mayor Rogers said, rubbing his chin. "If he's not an official officer, This could be serious. Just then, the front door burst open, and in walked none other than Officer Wright. His demeanor completely changed. He had an air of arrogance now, looking around the room as if he owned it. "Looking for trouble, are we?" he sneered, spotting Jason and Linda. "This man is a fraud." Jason shouted, fueled by anger. "You don't work for the HOA, and you have no right to fine anyone." Officer Wright sneered back. "You're in over your head, Cooper. You have no idea who you're dealing with." In a twist of fate, just as things began to escalate, a pair of real police officers entered the town hall, alerted by Mayor Rogers' office. "Sir, we have a situation," one officer said, looking at Officer Wright. "We have reports of you impersonating an officer and visiting residents without any authorization. Please step to the side." The room fell silent as Officer Wright's expression shifted from confidence to fear. "You can't do this to me," he protested. The police officers calmly placed handcuffs on him, leading him outside as the townspeople watched in shock. Linda squeezed Jason's arm, a mix of relief and triumph washing over them. "Hope this is the last we hear of him," she said softly. Weeks later, the HOA held a meeting where they reorganized the way they enforced community rules. With Officer Wright gone, the board promised to be fair and understanding. As Jason watered his garden, exhaling deeply, he felt a sense of pride. Being a part of the Maplewood community meant standing up for fairness and justice. And for the first time since arriving, he felt like he truly belonged. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, there stood a beautiful row of houses, each with its own charm. Among them was a modest, yet lovely home owned by Jake Carter. Jake was a kind man who loved his family and wanted nothing more than to live peacefully. However, that peace was often disturbed by the strict rules of the Homeowners Association, or HOA, that governed their community. The HOA was known for its strict regulations. They had rules about lawn height, paint colors, and even decorations. Jake sometimes found these rules too burdensome, but he often complied to keep the peace. That was until one fateful day when everything would change. One sunny afternoon, Jake was trimming his hedges when a man approached him. The man wore a dark uniform and carried a clipboard. "Good afternoon," he said smoothly. "I'm Inspector Greg from the HOA. I'm here to do a compliance inspection." Jake was taken aback. He had never seen this man before. "Inspector? I didn't know we were having an inspection today," Jake said nervously. "Oh, we have them quite often," Greg replied with a smile. "And it seems that you may have a few violations." Jake felt his stomach drop. He knew he kept his yard tidy but wondered what could have gone wrong. Greg walked around the house, scribbling notes on his clipboard. Jake followed nervously, trying to defend his lawn work. "I mowed just last week," he argued. "The flowers are all in line with HOA standards." Greg only nodded, his smile never fading. "There are always ways to improve," he said with an air of superiority. As the inspection continued, Jake noticed that Greg was making notes about things that seemed ridiculous. "Your garden gnomes don't match the HOA-approved style," Greg said, tapping his pen on the clipboard. Jake couldn't believe it. "They are just gnomes," he protested. Suddenly, Jake's wife, Lisa, came out with their toddler, Max, in her arms. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the tension. "This inspector says we're violating HOA rules," Jake explained, feeling embarrassed. "Oh, are you going to fine us?" Lisa asked with a mix of sarcasm and disbelief. Greg simply looked at them, his smile becoming inscrutable. "I will file my report, and you will receive any necessary fines in the mail," he replied. Just then, a noise came from behind some bushes. Jake turned to see a few of his neighbors peering out, curious about what was happening. Feeling frustrated, Jake decided he had enough. "You know what? You can't just show up here and ruin our day. If you're going to fine us, you might as well call the police," he said, half joking. To his surprise, Greg's smile faded, and he quickly closed his clipboard. "I don't think you want to do that," said Greg quietly, stepping back. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Why not? What do you mean?" Greg was starting to look nervous. "Because," he started, You might find out more about me than you bargained for." Just then, a police car pulled up. Jake's heart raced. He hoped they wouldn't take Greg's side. The officer stepped out and walked toward them, eyeing Greg, who was now visibly sweating. "What's the situation here?" the officer asked, taking note of the gathered crowd. Before Jake could say a word, Greg spoke up. "Just doing a routine inspection for the HOA," he said with a shaky voice. The officer raised an eyebrow. "You do look a bit out of place," he said. "Can I see your identification?" Greg's expression changed completely. He pulled out a badge, but the officer looked at it closely. "This is not legitimate," the officer said, narrowing his eyes. Greg stammered. I am authorized." But the officer stepped closer. "You are being detained for impersonating an inspector." At that moment, Jake felt a rush of confusion and disbelief wash over him. "What do you mean? He's not a real inspector?" Jake asked. "No, he isn't," the officer replied while putting handcuffs on Greg. "He has been reported for scamming homeowners." Jake felt a wave of relief. His heart went from racing in fear to racing with adrenaline. "Thank you, officer," he shouted. Lisa stood beside him, holding Max tightly. Neighbors whispered amongst themselves, shocked at what they saw. As the officer led Greg to the patrol car, Jake remembered something. Wait, if he pretended to be the HOA's inspector, then who is the real inspector? He shouted as a thought struck him. The officer paused for a moment and nodded. "I'll look into it, but for now, you should file a complaint with your HOA. This isn't right." Greg was placed inside the car, still struggling to maintain his composure. "You'll pay for this. You don't even know who you're messing with," he shouted as the door slammed. With Greg gone, Jake turned to the neighbors who had gathered. "What just happened?" Jake asked. One neighbor, Mrs. Hargrove, spoke up. "I knew something was off about him. We've had suspicions for months. He's been on the lookout for people to scam." Jake felt proud that he had stood up against injustice, but the excitement wasn't over. The real inspector turned out to be someone from a nearby town, an amiable woman named Officer Helen who was sent to check on properties. She arrived later that week and assured the neighborhood that they were safe. With the false inspector behind bars, the HOA reevaluated its practices. They promised to provide the residents with clear identification and a proper inspection schedule. Around a bonfire, Jake, Lisa, and their neighbors celebrated their newfound freedom from shady activities in their neighborhood. In the end, the community banded together, knowing they would always look out for one another. They realized that sometimes, when everyone stands united, even the most powerful can fall. Jake smiled, knowing that he had not only defended his home but had also helped protect his family and community. And that, in itself, was the greatest victory of all. Here is a story based on your instructions. The crisp morning air did little to soothe the simmering anger that had been brewing inside Mark for weeks. It all started with the new Homeowners Association, or HOA, president, a portly man named Mr. Abernathy, who seemed to have a personal vendetta against Mark. Abernathy, with his slicked-back hair and perpetual scowl, had turned the once peaceful neighborhood into a battleground of petty rules and exorbitant fines. Mark, a detective with the Internal Affairs Division, was used to dealing with corrupt individuals, but he never imagined he'd find one in his own suburban community. It began with minor infractions, an alleged inch too high of grass, a misplaced garbage bin. Each violation came with a hefty fine, adding insult to injury. Mark tried reasoning with Abernathy, attending HOA meetings, presenting evidence that contradicted the claims, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. Abernathy, it seemed, was determined to make Mark's life miserable. His abusing his power, Mark muttered to his wife, Sarah, over breakfast one morning. Sarah, a lawyer, was equally frustrated. "We could sue," she suggested, "but that would take time and money. And Abernathy seems to thrive on conflict." Mark sighed, "I just want to live in peace. Is that too much to ask?" The tension escalated when Mark received a notice stating that his property would be inspected for structural violations by a certified inspector named David Miller the following day. Mark found it odd, as he had recently renovated his house with all the necessary permits and approvals. Something felt off. He decided to do some digging. A quick search online revealed that no certified inspector named David Miller was registered in the state. That's it, Mark said to himself. This has gone too far. He knew Abernathy was trying to intimidate him, but sending a fake inspector was a new low. Mark decided to turn the tables. He called his partner, Detective Reynolds, and explained the situation. Reynolds, a seasoned officer with a knack for undercover work, was immediately on board. "I'll pose as a concerned neighbor," Reynolds said, "see what this inspector is up to." The next day, Mark waited anxiously as a beat-up sedan pulled up to his driveway. A man in a cheap suit emerged, carrying a clipboard and a phony-looking ID badge. It was David Miller, or whoever he was pretending to be. Mark watched from his window as the man approached his front door. Before the fake inspector could ring the bell, Reynolds casually strolled over, pretending to water his lawn. "Good morning," Reynolds said, flashing a friendly smile. "Are you the inspector? I'm a neighbor, just curious about what's going on." The man hesitated. "Just routine inspections, sir. Nothing to worry about." Reynolds pressed further. "Mind if I see your credentials? Just want to make sure everything's legitimate." The man fumbled with his ID, his face growing increasingly pale. He stammered, I don't have to show you anything." At that moment, Mark emerged from his house, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. "Actually, you do," Mark said, his voice firm. "I'm Detective Mark Johnson, Internal Affairs. And I have a few questions for you." The man's eyes widened in panic. He tried to make a run for it, but Mark quickly apprehended him. Reynolds, still in character, feigned surprise. "What's going on, detective?" Reynolds asked, playing his part perfectly. "This man is impersonating a certified inspector," Mark explained, "and attempting to conduct fraudulent inspections on behalf of the HOA. He's also wanted for questioning regarding several counts of fraud." As Mark placed the man in handcuffs, a crowd of neighbors began to gather. They watched in stunned silence as the fake inspector was led away. Among them was Mr. Abernathy, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "You can't do this," Abernathy shouted. "He's just doing his job." Mark turned to Abernathy, his gaze unwavering. "Your reign of terror is over, Abernathy. We have enough evidence to launch a full investigation into your activities. Impersonating an inspector, fraud, and abuse of power, that's just the beginning." The crowd erupted in applause as Abernathy's face turned crimson with rage and embarrassment. The fake inspector was taken to the local precinct, where he confessed to being hired by Abernathy to harass Mark and other residents who dared to question his authority. The news of Abernathy's scheme spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood. Residents who had been too afraid to speak out against him now came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The HOA board was forced to hold an emergency meeting, where Abernathy was unanimously voted out of office. In the following weeks, Mark worked tirelessly to uncover the full extent of Abernathy's corruption. He discovered that Abernathy had been skimming money from the HOA funds, awarding contracts to his cronies, and using his position to settle personal scores. The evidence was overwhelming, and Abernathy was eventually arrested and charged with multiple felonies. With Abernathy gone, the neighborhood began to heal. A new, more responsible HOA board was elected, and the community returned to its peaceful state. Mark, once the target of Abernathy's vendetta, was hailed as a hero. He had not only exposed a corrupt official but also restored justice and harmony to his community. One evening, as Mark and Sarah sat on their porch, watching the sunset, Sarah smiled. "You know," she said, "I always knew you were a good cop, but I never realized you were such a great neighbor." Mark chuckled, "Just doing my job, protecting and serving." The peace was, however, short-lived. One fine morning Mark got a call from a person who introduced himself as an auditor. "Hello, Detective Johnson. My name is Kevin. I am an external auditor with the state's Financial Regulatory Board. I would like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss certain anomalies that my colleagues and I have unearthed." These relate to financial irregularities involving the homeowners association. Mark agreed to meet Kevin in his office the following morning. Detective Johnson, your investigation into Abernathy has raised several red flags during our standard audit, Kevin began. It appears the new HOA board elected after Abernathy's removal may not be as clean as we hoped. Mark leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of irregularities are we talking about? Significant sums of money seem to be missing, funneled into offshore accounts, Kevin explained, spreading several documents on the table. Our analysis shows that while Abernathy was indeed corrupt, his successors might be even more sophisticated in their embezzlement. Mark felt a familiar surge of anger. He had hoped the community could finally move forward, but it seemed corruption had merely evolved, not disappeared. Do you have any leads on who might be involved? Kevin nodded. We have identified several board members who seem to be connected to these transactions. The scale of the operation suggests a well-coordinated effort, potentially involving individuals outside the HOA as well. Mark knew what he had to do. I'll need all the information you have, he said, his mind already racing. I'll launch an investigation immediately. The people in this community deserve better. As he delved deeper, Mark uncovered a complex web of deceit. The new HOA president, Mrs. Davison, initially appeared to be a beacon. It was a Tuesday morning when the trouble began. I, Mark Johnson, was sipping my coffee, enjoying the brief calm before the storm of work hit. As an officer with internal affairs, peace was a rare commodity in my life. I lived in a modest, two-story house in a neighborhood governed by a rather zealous homeowners association, HOA. We'd had our disagreements, mostly about the length of my grass or the color of my mailbox, but nothing too serious. Until now. A black sedan I had never seen before pulled up to my curb. A man in a cheap suit got out. He had a clipboard in hand and an air of self-importance that made my teeth itch. Good morning, sir, he said, his voice oozing with false politeness. I'm here for the HOA inspection. I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't notified about any inspection. He consulted his clipboard. Yes, it seems there was a notification sent out last week. Perhaps it was missed. He gave me a condescending smile. Anyway, I'm Mr. Thompson, and I need to inspect the premises for compliance with HOA regulations. Something felt off. The HOA usually gave at least a week's notice for inspections, and I hadn't received anything. Plus, this guy looked like he'd bought his suit from a thrift store. But I decided to play along. All right, Mr. Thompson. Lead the way. He strutted around my yard, pointing out minor imperfections. The hedges are slightly uneven, he'd say. There's a small stain on the driveway. And is that a weed I see in the flower bed? I bit back a sarcastic comment. Anything else, Mr. Thompson? He paused, tapping his pen against the clipboard. Yes, actually. The most egregious violation is the unauthorized basketball hoop in the driveway. Now, this was ridiculous. The basketball hoop had been there for years, long before I even moved in. The previous owners had it, and the HOA had never said a word about it. That hoop has been here for years, I pointed out. It was here when I bought the house. Ignorance is no excuse, sir, Thompson said, his smile vanishing. The regulations are clear. No recreational equipment is allowed in the driveway. You will be fined $500. $500. That was outrageous. I'm going to need to see that regulation in writing, I said, my cop instincts kicking in. Thompson's eyes flickered nervously. I don't have it with me, but I assure you, it exists. Then I'm not paying any fine until I see it, I said, crossing my arms. He puffed out his chest. You are being uncooperative, sir. I have the authority to issue this fine, and I suggest you comply. And I suggest you produce the regulation, I retorted. The situation escalated quickly. Thompson started yelling about my non-compliance, threatening further fines and legal action. I remained calm, but my suspicion grew. This wasn't a legitimate HOA inspection. It was a setup. I think it's time we clarify a few things, I said, reaching for my phone. I'm going to call the HOA president and confirm your identity and this supposed violation. Thompson's face paled. He stammered, "That won't be necessary. I have to go. I have other inspections to conduct." He turned to leave, but I blocked his path. "Not so fast, Mr. Thompson. I'm not letting you leave until we get to the bottom of this." He tried to push past me, but I grabbed his arm. "You're not going anywhere." "Take your hands off me," he shouted, trying to pull away. That's when I decided to reveal my true identity. "I'm a police officer with internal affairs," I said, flashing my badge. "And I think you have some explaining to do." The color drained from his face. He stopped struggling, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said, my voice hardening. "Who sent you here? Who told you to issue this fake fine?" He remained silent, but his body language spoke volumes. He was clearly hiding something. I didn't have time to play games. I called for backup, explaining the situation to the dispatcher. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived, sirens wailing. The officers took Thompson into custody. He didn't resist. His head hung low in shame. As they led him away in handcuffs, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. But the question remained. Who was behind this? Back inside, I started making calls. First, I contacted the HOA president, Mrs. Davison, a sweet old lady who was always polite and reasonable. She was shocked to hear about the incident and confirmed that they had not sent anyone to inspect my property. She also stated she didn't know anyone named Mr. Thompson. She was as confused as I was and promised to look into it. Next, I called my colleagues at Internal Affairs. I explained the situation and asked them to run a background check on Thompson. What they found was disturbing. "Mark," my colleague said over the phone, "our guy Thompson is a con artist with a history of fraud and extortion. He's been running scams for years, posing as everything from a building inspector to a health official. He usually targets vulnerable people, like the elderly or recent immigrants. So, he was hired to target me," I concluded. But by whom? The answer came sooner than I expected. The next day, Mrs. Davison called me, her voice trembling. "Mark, I think I know who's behind this." She explained that a few weeks ago, a new member had joined the HOA board, a man named Mr. Harrison. He was aggressive and demanding, constantly pushing for stricter enforcement of the regulations. He had also made several veiled threats against me, hinting that I was not a team player and that I would face the consequences if I didn't comply with his demands. "I didn't take him seriously at the time," Mrs. Davison said, "but now I'm convinced he's the one who hired Thompson." I thanked Mrs. Davison and immediately contacted my colleagues. They brought Harrison in for questioning. Initially, he denied any involvement, but after hours of interrogation and the presentation of evidence gathered from Thompson, he cracked. Harrison confessed that he had hired Thompson to harass me. He resented my position in the community and saw me as a threat to his authority. He wanted to make my life miserable and force me to move out of the neighborhood. The motive was petty, but the crime was serious. Harrison was charged with conspiracy, harassment, and fraud. He faced a hefty fine and possible jail time. As for me, I was relieved that the ordeal was over. The HOA board voted to remove Harrison from his position, and Mrs. Davison assured me that things would return to normal. But the experience left me shaken. It was a stark reminder that even in the most ordinary of places, darkness can lurk. And that sometimes, the people you least expect are the ones who will try to harm you. In the end, justice prevailed. Thompson was brought to justice, Harrison faced the consequences of his actions, and I was able to return to my life, albeit with a newfound appreciation for the importance of vigilance and the occasional absurdity of suburban life. And yes, the basketball hoop stayed.